The subject that we're going to discuss now is of real and significant importance to owners because it's got a monetary value to it. And it's the subject of importation of aircraft into the EU and the payment or non-payment of VAT. And we're essentially going to be looking at three questions from the perspective of an owner buying an aircraft, which first question, do I need to fully import my aircraft into the EU? Or are there alternatives, temporary admission, ignore the EU completely because I'm never going to be flying to the EU? If I do need to import the aircraft fully into the EU, where will I be importing it? What is the rate of VAT in that country? Will I be paying that VAT? Or are there exemptions? Is the rate of VAT zero? Or if I pay the VAT, can I recover? And the third question is, as an owner, what is my appetite for risk? You know, if I seek advice and my advisors tell me, there are options to avoid, for want of a better word, the VAT. What is the risk attached to that? Whether it be an economic risk of that structure being clawed back, or reputational risk. But the bottom line, as I mentioned, is monetary. And if I'm an owner and I've just bought a $60 million aircraft and I'm bringing it into the UK, and I don't do anything in order to attempt to mitigate my VAT risk or liability, and I end up paying irrecoverable VAT, then in the UK the rate of VAT is 20%. I'd be handing over $12 million to the UK tax authorities with possibly no chance of recovering it. So it's an issue that clearly owners focus on, and in my view, and we'll come to this, should focus on earlier in the process of buying an aircraft than they tend to. So we have four real experts on VAT today with, by my calculation, over 80 years, well, up to 80 years of experience in this area. Going from left to right, as you see it, Heather Gordon, Martyn Fiddler. Heather is Chief Legal Officer at Martyn Fiddler, previously at Keynes in the Isle of Man. Martyn Fiddler, as many of you will be aware, has been in the business for over 30 years, specialising on EU VAT, customs duties, permanent importation, temporary admission, and recently customs warehousing. Hugo Jenney heads up the tax team at the UK law firm Stephenson Harwood. Hugo is a leading UK advisor on VAT, both in the context of jets and yachts, as well as aviation more widely. Lasse Rungholm will be very well known to many of you. OPMAS was established by Lasse in the early 90s, and they specialise in EU importation, customs duty and VAT. And Nic Arnold, PwC, director of PwC's private client tax team. Nic also heads up the luxury asset advisory group at PwC, specialising in advising high net worth individuals on cross-border tax. So I think I'd like to start, and I might sit down and join the panelists. I'd like to start with Heather. October 2017, as I'm sure many people who, especially those who read The Guardian or watch the BBC, will have been aware, in the Paradise Papers leak, there was much discussion of a structure, an Isle of Man structure that Lewis Hamilton had entered into. And following that, HMRC launched an investigation into customs, into Isle of Man customs and excise and Isle of Man customs and excise structures. And following that, the European Commission has now launched an investigation in the Isle of Man. So Heather, what is the status of these investigations, and has it had an impact on the way that owners look at Isle of Man structures at the moment?
Okay. I think it was a very interesting case, and I think the first thing to say about Mr. Hamilton and his aircraft is that there was nothing wrong with that structure, and I think that's been looked at by all the papers and agreed. But it did cause the Isle of Man Customs and Excise to look to HM Treasury in the UK and ask for them to review their processes and procedures to make sure that everything was in line with which they previously agreed and which all aircraft had been imported in. That started just after the Paradise Papers in November 17 and was concluded towards spring 18, to which we were then told we would get a report. We haven't got the report yet, and the EU Commission have requested the UK, or they requested that the UK provide an answer to them by January this year, and we understand that they have provided a response to them. We're just not aware of exactly what that is yet. So I checked the news about 5 minutes ago to ensure that no sneaky person decided to publicise the report in the last 5 minutes, because that would be very unfair. And so far, we're just not aware of what the report actually says.
So if ultimately the Commission, for want of a better phrase, finds against the Isle of Man, what would happen to all the aircraft that have been imported into the Isle of Man using the structure that the Commission is investigating, do you think?
I think you can't give a definitive answer, but the strongest possible answer that I could give is that if all of those aircraft have been imported using the regulations that the Isle of Man has set forth and the procedures that they have to go to get that VAT registration, and bearing in mind that the Isle of Man Customs and Excise were always in full dialogue with HMRC and understanding those processes, I'm not sure that anybody would be able to ask for the VAT back. They've been imported in accordance with those rules. Now, going forward, if they would say you can't do that anymore, that route would stop.
I mean, Hugo, the Isle of Man structure, the Isle of Man importation method is just one of one method used across the European Union. For those who might not be familiar with the rules on sort of EU importation generally, summarise for us in 2 minutes the entirety of EU VAT legislation in the business jet space.
At least it wasn't the entirety of Brexit in 2 minutes.
That's coming next.
Just in case there's anyone in the audience who isn't familiar with the subject, we'll just go all the way back to basics, just very quickly. You could think of the EU as a fortress, and within it, there's a fortress with walls around it, and within it you have freedom of movement of people, goods, capital and services. We're focused here more on goods. So aircraft can, broadly speaking, move freely within the EU with frictionless borders. Aircraft are in free circulation, so they can move from one territory to another, broadly speaking, without problems. For aircraft which have not yet been imported into Europe, so manufactured outside Europe or purchased outside Europe, you may have, for example, an EU business or even a foreign business or a private owner. They have an aircraft, they would like to fly it around Europe. They need to get through the wall, which wraps around this area with unicorns flying around within it and the wonderful EU free zone. They need to get their aircraft into free circulation. So they've got to find a gateway into the EU, and there are a number of gateways. Obviously, if you're part of the EU single market, you can freely move. If you're not part of the EU single market or customs union, so take the customs union, if you're not part of that, you may have customs duty to pay on the way in. If you're not part of the single market, you may have VAT on importation on the way in. That is an incredible simplification, because actually what happens is you go and find the right gate, and there is a WTO gate, and that WTO gate is regulated by an agreement on trade in civil aircraft and Chicago Convention. So for many aircraft owners, particularly airlines, you can fly in and out of Europe without too many difficulties vis-à-vis customs duties and VAT. But for other types of owners, they've got to go and find, if they can, a gate which allows them to operate freely within the EU. And we've heard about the temporary importation gate. That's one, sorry, I hope everyone's been hearing me. That's one possible gate, the temporary importation gate. Another possible gate would be the airline zero rating gate, or you might go for the full importation gate with or without recovery of VAT. And that is the Isle of Man gate in essence. It is a full importation with recovery of VAT gate. Don't worry about customs duty. Broadly speaking, you shouldn't have to suffer customs duty on flying aircraft and parts into the EU. But VAT is your problem. Import VAT is the issue. And with Brexit coming up, that's where the question mark lies over the UK and the Isle of Man. They may no longer be gateways to the EU if they're not in the EU. I'm not sure if I've explained it so that everyone will have understood, but that is my attempt.
Well, the answers to the number of no's on the question, are you confident that you understand the EU VAT on aircraft, has gone down from 72% to 68% since Hugo started talking. So we've moved 4% of the audience, and we'll attempt in the next 19 minutes to move as many as we can.
It just got worse.
Off the remainder. Did it just get worse? Oh dear. That's when I started speaking. Yeah. I think one of the key things, before we come on to Nick, one of the key things to recall is the difference between VAT on the sale of an aircraft and VAT on the importation of an aircraft. It's not enough, as we do, to take an aircraft, if we're buying a pre-owned aircraft, out of the European Union to, say, Guernsey, sell it whilst it's physically located in Guernsey, and then bring it back in. Because VAT will be paid, that would be an obvious means of avoiding VAT, because VAT will be paid on the importation of that aircraft. The key thing from if I'm acting for a seller is that that's no longer my problem. I'm selling the aircraft outside the EU, I'm free and clear. And then when it's the buyer's issue, then how they import it. One sort of technical point for Hugo, for us, Nick. If I'm buying an Airbus aircraft or a Dassault aircraft from within the European Union, is that already in free circulation?
Broadly speaking, if you buy it within the EU, you'll be buying it from a business, and it will charge you VAT if you're going to keep the aircraft in the EU. So you'll pay that VAT, and you may be able to recover it if you're a business. If you're taking the aircraft outside the EU, i.e. it's for export, then they should be able to not charge you the VAT, and you should be able to take the aircraft out of the EU and operate it outside the EU and have paid no VAT.
Thanks. So Nick, sort of the same question as for Heather really. Have you noticed the attitude of owners to risk? Have you noticed that changed in the last few years, specifically after the Lewis Hamilton case and the investigations?
Definitely. I quite liked Hugo's analogy of gates. Lots of gates, lots of clients. So I tend to be the voice of doom somewhat, where I'm always saying, have you checked this? Do you know their tax profile on that? What's the most important thing for each individual client? And there is a common theme that clients are becoming much more conscious about the world around them and what people think of them. And that's in all aspects of their lives. Ultra high net worths who tend to mix business and pleasure with a lot of these aircraft are truly global. The world is becoming smaller. We've got everything from information sharing and transparency to unexplained wealth orders in the UK. We've got criminal corporate offence. We've got them being looked at in all sorts of different angles. And definitely all the various gates that Hugo mentions, which are the various ways of bringing your aircraft into the EU and then operating them in the EU. They want to have a look at what gate means, what gate means what to what client, and how can it be attacked or challenged in any given scenario, to the extent that I've done work with clients who have done quite a deep dive into the historic tax profile of large assets that they're buying to make sure that there aren't any risks that they are buying along the way in any given assets. Tax that hasn't been paid on it. The Isle of Man is part of that conversation. It's not the only part of it at all. I have had clients ringing up to say, do we need to completely dismantle an Isle of Man structure? And that definitely isn't a definite no. And it's not a yes, it's a, well, let's have a look and see how you've been running this. And if there's any room for either HMRC to get their teeth into it, or perhaps more importantly, a journalist who do delight in turning what was quite interesting tax evasion once, now tax avoidance is definitely a journalistic item that can be talked about and written about, and cameras running after clients about. So it is dead. People do take it very seriously these days. Yeah.
I think it's worth flagging a point that Heather made, which is in the Guardian reportage on the Lewis Hamilton structure and on the BBC reportage.
Yeah.
They both went out of their way to say that the structure is perfectly legal. You know, some
Yeah.
professors of tax law, when asked by the Guardian to opine on that structure, had a different view than from tax advisors in the Isle of Man and the Isle of Man Customs and Excise. But there was no implication that those structures or any other structures that we work on were actually
Legal doesn't
illegal
mean
in any way.
Yeah. Legal isn't enough these days.
Yeah, which is a good point as well, because you know, as I say, there's professional risk, there's reputational risk. But Lasse, I think looking at the OPMAS website, you maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but OPMAS at the moment seems to focus very much on temporary admission. And is that a solution that you see more widely applicable now?
Yes. Just to give a very quick brief for those who may not know, there are only two ways of flying into Europe or into the EU. One is by doing a full importation, that can be with a VAT recovery or not, paying the VAT as a private, or via the 0% AOC route, or you can do a temporary admission. There are only the two. There seems to be a misunderstanding that people say, no, we can just do nothing. That's not an option. If you don't do a full import, you will be doing a temporary admission. Or you may not know that, but you will be doing it, or you will be subject to the regulations in the temporary admission regime. I don't know if you know where that comes from. There was a lot of different conventions back in the 50s, private aircraft or private means of transport, and then public. It was all consolidated into the Istanbul Convention in 1990, which came into effect in 1993. It's a global thing. It's not an EU thing. The Istanbul Convention allows you to use your boat or your aircraft or your car, drive into another country without having to pay the excise taxes or the duty or whatever. In the EU, that's been incorporated into the Union Customs Code, and it's applicable all over the customs territory as defined in Article 4 or 250, I forget, I mixed the two, either one. Anyway, the customs territory of the EU comprises all of the EU member states, still, the United Kingdom. God knows what will happen, but it also includes the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands. It excludes Greenland and Faroe Islands, French overseas territories and stuff like that. That's all, you can see that in the Union Customs Code. If you want to do a temporary admission, you basically don't have to do anything. You can fly in and you can fly out. That's what the airlines do every day, like you mentioned. You know, whenever it comes in from the UAE, they do a temporary admission, they fly out again. If you don't want to do a TA, you have to go through the hoops, do the full import, sign up. It has to work for you. You have to be established in the EU, blah, 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 all that stuff. Heather might be able to do that for you in the Isle of Man or in Holland or whatever. But if you do reside outside the EU customs territory, you can do a temporary admission. And basically, you don't have to do anything. A lot of confusion surrounds the oral declaration support form. You don't have to do that. You just have to be able to, at any point in time, prove when did you enter and when did you leave. You're allowed for aircraft up to 6 months. You don't have to do anything. You fly in, you fly out. That's it. That was a brief on TA. That's the other option as the full importation.
Should I just say, is it fair to say, Lasse, that the TA route is, as you said, for foreign residents, broadly speaking, whereas if you are an EU established business or you are going to do a lot of carrying of EU residents, you're going to have to think carefully about using TA.
If you are an EU established entity, you cannot use temporary admission. That's not allowed. If you carry EU resident people on board, you may be able to use TA anyway. It's a huge difference between the two. But yes, it's for non-EU residents only.
So I think, as ever, it's devil in the detail for any given client situation, for sure. And it is used in the yacht world as much as the aviation world. But it's understood, I think people on the ground understand it a bit better in the yachting industry, because it's used a bit more.
Getting some good questions coming up, which I want to address before we go on to Brexit. But one of the questions, why not operating the aircraft commercially on an AOC with a VAT-exempt European operator? I guess for you, Nic, one of the people will often say, oh, the solution is I'm going to put my aircraft on with an AOC holder, i.e. a qualifying airline, and get that operator to import it, and therefore import it zero-rated. That is an option that people use. Do your clients tend to go for that option?
It's another gate. It's another one of Hugo's gates. Definitely an option. Frankly, aircraft are expensive. If you want third-party income to support the cost of your aircraft, then you need to have the right regulatory backup for that, of which an AOC is part of that. And that's how you'll get third-party income. From my perspective, protecting clients from tax authority challenges, from journalistic challenges, it has to be the commercial aspects first. I want to have a third party on my aircraft, therefore I need this structure. The fact that it gives me access to zero rating of VAT, and the fact that the ultimate owner of that aircraft might be part of the picture of the benefit of that, has to be secondary. And it has to be very clear why that structure is in place. And if there's any, and I don't even like to use the word structure anymore, journalists love it. It's just a solution, and it's a commercial solution. And the use of the aircraft by the UBO needs to be looked at very carefully, and made sure that it is in accordance with the overall business.
But Hugo, what happens if I use a UK AOC holder to import my aircraft into the UK, and then I fall out with them 6 months later and decide I want to move on to another operator?
You're asking me that question?
Yeah.
That is an interesting question. Which I have thought about before, and constantly comes up. I think you could just export the aircraft out of the EU and start again. There might be another way of doing it, which is to transfer the aircraft to another operator free of VAT, another EU established operator free of VAT, and they could take over the operation and carry on as before, provided they qualify as an airline. The one thing I will say, and it's just worth commenting on what you were saying, Nic, is I've looked at the various, and I apologise to operators out here, but it's worth pointing out that when you look at the terms and conditions of the operators, they will standardly throw all tax risk onto the owner of the aircraft. So whilst they may be importing the aircraft, they may be claiming the airline exemption, they may and will often be throwing all of the risk of that onto you as the owner. And I doubt they will be very easily convinced to take the risk themselves, unless they are literally putting that structure in as part of their selling and marketing pitch, which I haven't seen a huge amount of yet.
And in fact, at the very last minute with the aircraft that we were working with, the AOC didn't want to be the party of import at the very last minute, which we weren't expecting. And I think it was something to do with them getting a bit more savvy about what their tax risk was and what they did and didn't want to be involved in.
I guess the thing to emphasise is if you're bringing an aircraft in using an AOC, the aircraft has to be genuinely up for chartering, and the owner can't interfere with that. There's a question on, with apologies that there's no one from Malta on the panel, but there's a question on Malta, which I think is just, maybe for Heather, can the panel share any insight on why Malta is under scrutiny for its approach on VAT on imports? It's worth stressing that that the Commission is investigating Malta alongside Cyprus, Greece, I believe maybe in a couple of other states. But on the yacht side, I don't believe that investigation is also relating to jets. But Heather looks like she doesn't want to answer that one. Hugo.
I think it's the general concept of how they're interpreting the EU law, really, and bringing that into line with the substance of the interpretation rather than the actual legal position. What am I doing? I'm converting a goods to a service, and irrespective of the asset in question, it was the mechanics of that was being looked at.
I think, if I may add, that it may have a little bit to do with the option for Russian people to buy citizenship, or what do we call it, be allowed to reside in the EU, and then if you bring in business and stuff like that. So that's just what I've heard.
They're getting in trouble for all sorts.
You're saying it's political, Lasse?
Sorry?
You're saying it's political?
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, I think there is...
And possibly France isn't being investigated because the French investigator's French. Maybe that's it.
I think Malta is potentially under scrutiny as well on the yachting side and the aircraft and the yachts, because the solutions that were being provided are quite similar. I think the aviation side falls under that, but most of the scrutiny is on the yachting side.
I think the reason why a lot of scrutiny is also on the yachting side, and anybody from Malta may want to interject, is that as far as I understand, there are about 1,000 yachts that have used the Malta leasing structure, but only about 6 jets. So the jets regime is a lot less than on the yacht side. The Malta scheme doesn't. Sorry, the lady from Malta, I guess.
So Katerina GVZH Advocates. Just to clarify, the problems are with the VAT leasing structure, which has nothing to do with importation, and that is only for yachts. That structure doesn't really exist for aircrafts. So it has nothing to do with aircraft importation and yacht importation. So the importations are still valid, same system we use as the yacht leasing structure that at the moment doesn't exist anymore.
Right. I'm not sure everybody heard the clarification, but that's very helpful. Thank you. In the limit, we're running out of time, so we really should. There was a very good question on the blurring. Actually, before we do Brexit, there was a very good question on the blurring of the line between commercial use and personal use, which is obviously pivotal to some of the gateways, as Hugo describes them, that we use. Hugo, so any thoughts on that? When does business and pleasure intermingle? I mean, take somebody like Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton is a brand in himself. And when does Lewis Hamilton's usage of an aircraft become personal?
Well, as I understand it, Lewis used the Isle of Man as his destination for importing. So he would typically have had to submit a business plan, and the business plan would have to show, it doesn't actually have to show a profit, but you'd be a fool not to try and show that your business is going to try and show a profit. So he would typically have been hiring the aircraft to himself or his business. And I think that's perfectly valid. He would be using the aircraft for business purposes. The problem is if he then starts using the aircraft a lot for personal use, mainly for holidays. And we've seen examples of the tax authorities investigating. One of their standard questions is to look at the destinations in great detail. Personally, I think as long as there are two ways that the Isle of Man could have gone with someone like Lewis Hamilton if he was using it for personal use. One is if he's charging himself, i.e. his company imports the aircraft and charges him an arm's length rate of VAT, and the private use is not more than a sort of rule of thumb is 30%. There is no real percentage out there which is accepted. Then that should be an acceptable use of the aircraft. Whether the EU Commission will find it acceptable after the UK has reported is another matter. The alternative is he doesn't pay for the use of the aircraft, and there could be an adjustment to the amount of VAT recovered. So either way, you should get to the right answer. But it is true that hiding private use behind business use and just pretending that you're using an aircraft for business use when it's all private isn't going to work. But I personally think that what's happened is that a lot of yacht thinking has infected private jets or business jets. Business jets are, as the name suggests, used for business. Yachts are typically not used for business. And people were recovering VAT on yachts by reference to use in their business. That's clearly nonsense. But in the context of aircraft, it makes perfect sense to be using your aircraft for business purposes and to have a little bit of private use on the side. I don't think that's a problem, as long as you correctly comply with the rules in the relevant jurisdiction.
One follow-up question, I guess, Hugo, is after March, is the UK or the Isle of Man going to care what the Commission thinks? Deliberately.
That's a provocative question. I'm sure Heather's going to say they're going to just stick two fingers up at the EU, even though we're going into a transitional, and say you can kiss your fines and penalties goodbye. Maybe not.
So Heather, if the Commission fines against the Isle of Man, will the Isle of Man just ignore what the Commission says post-March?
I don't think the Isle of Man will ignore it. I think they'll certainly take into consideration that the UK is leaving Europe, and what does that mean. But the Isle of Man will listen. They will do their best to make sure that everything is the way it should be and people are reporting correctly.
Mark, one sort of final thing as we head towards lunch with the mixed use of private and business. Everybody focuses on VAT massively, and rightly so, because it's a very big number of a very big asset, not to mention the fuel as well. But the direct taxes are relevant for UK domiciled individuals, British people, or foreigners that have been here for a really long time. The benefit in kind aspects are becoming more and more onerous, and HMRC are really going for them. So it's just, when it comes to mixed use of aircraft, it mustn't be missed.
Time's kind of up, but let's just have a few words on Brexit. There's a Brexit panel this afternoon, so I won't go into too much detail on what's going to happen with the customs union or the UK's relationship with the customs union, but the question I certainly get asked the most, so maybe a quick straw poll from the panel, is aircraft that have been imported into the EU prior to Brexit, say there's a hard Brexit, will those aircraft, imported into the EU through the UK or the Isle of Man, will those aircraft still have grandfathered status in the EU almost regardless of what happens with Brexit? Hugo, yes or no? Grandfather, no analysis, just a punt, yes or no?
No, after the transitional period.
Heather?
Do I think they'll still be grandfathered in? Yes.
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 I think I'm really hoping for yes. It's going to be an absolute mess.
Yeah.
I think the aviation industry is having enough challenge on the regulatory side without taking away a tax-paid status, so I hope yes.
I'm kind of yes on this as well, so it's 4 yeses. Sounds like Simon Cowell. 4 yeses and 1 no from Hugo.
Well, they're imported into the EU, not into the UK. Right?
Well,
so they're imported into the EU. That doesn't mean they're exported just because the UK leaves. That's just happened to be where the practical transaction took place.
I think also you have to say this wouldn't just apply to aircraft. This is going to be everything imported, and that makes me think it would be too massive to say everything's out.
Well, there's a train of thought that says the UK leaving the EU is like a massive en masse export, and that thereafter everything has to be imported back in. I mean, is that not logical?
The default position is surely that they can't move across borders after we've exited, unless there's a special arrangement to facilitate that. Will there be a special arrangement? If you've imported into the UK, after we've exited, will the EU say, yes, fine, you paid your VAT, you recovered it in the UK, you can now fly it around Europe as much as you like? I'm not sure. It's possible, but I wouldn't assume it. We're predicting it's possible that there will be a grandfathering, but you can't assume it.
So if we're...
I think much as I know this is a crowd pleaser, and, you know, Brexit and VAT are two of my favourite topics in the world. I think we're going to have to break for lunch.
I think you're not lying, are you?
I think we probably ought to break for lunch. Do you think, Mark? Do you want to ask one last question?
No,
One last comment, Mark.
No, I wouldn't dare stand between... the last thing in the world you want is a lawyer standing between yourselves and lunch. But I think we've lost people, actually. I think we were doing quite well, and then now we've gone backwards. So...
Okay, we've got one quick comment from Simon from the Isle of Man Aircraft Registry.
So thank you for that, and I'll keep it very brief. I think it's very important at the outset, and it might have been just a slip of the tongue, maybe the way it came out, but it was suggested that HMRC, UK HMRC, launched an investigation. To be very clear, the Isle of Man government requested that HMRC undertake an assessment of the practice of importing business jets. So that review was requested and instigated by the Isle of Man government. They are confident that it's been in accordance with the guidelines that they discussed with the National Audit Office and the Tax Office. We will see what the report generates, but I think the point I wanted to make is that it was instigated by the Isle of Man government. So thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good point for anybody who didn't hear. I think I said that the HMRC launched an investigation into Customs and Excise. It was Customs and Excise that requested the HMRC, which has overview over Isle of Man Customs and Excise, to look into it. So apologies for that. I'm sure there'll be many lawsuits flying around after this short panel. If we failed, and actually we're getting even worse, if we failed to, if we failed to enhance everyone's understanding of EU VAT, please do come to Al's Corporate Jet Investor Summer School in July, where Hugo does a really fantastic half-an-hour session on EU VAT, which covers pretty much everything. I guess the closing point really before lunch, which was one of the questions, is there's no one-size-fits-all solution on this. It really does depend upon the individual circumstances of any particular owner, and they should seek advice from the experts, and they should seek it early in the process. It's amazing how often you're 1 week away from somebody buying an aircraft, and they'll ring you up and say, "Oh, I've just found out that I'll be paying VAT if I import the aircraft. What do I do about it?" The whole process needs to be thought through from the beginning. So my final closing thoughts really are: as is suggested by the results, it's an extremely complicated area. Seek advice from experts and seek it early. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lunch is through there.